Alright, let's talk about sound design. Let's make some birds in PhasePlant. Alright, so this is an empty session created from my sound design template. Let's open an instance of PhasePlant. By default, PhasePlant opens on an empty patch. In the generator section, let's create an oscillator and set its waveform to sine wave. Pressing notes on a MIDI keyboard will now play sine waves. The very first thing I tend to do on a new patch is create a volume envelope. So let's bring the oscillator's level to 0. The patch is now silent when I play a MIDI note. Let's move over to the modulator section and instantiate an ADSR envelope. The little orange thingy is the modulation source from the envelope. If you're familiar with Eurorack modules, think of it as the module's CV output. Let's click on it. All the new orange plus symbols are potential modulation targets, the equivalent of CV inputs. Let's modulate the level of the oscillator module. By right-clicking on the newly created modulation, you can then enter a precise modulation amount by typing it. Now, pressing a note plays a sine wave. By lowering the sustain level to 0, we're essentially switching from an ADSR to an AD envelope. For sound effect design, unless I'm designing a loop, I tend to use AD envelopes instead of ADSR envelopes. This gives me more control over the sound's dynamic profile and allows me to get consistent results no matter what duration I press a MIDI key. Let's add some hold time to make it a bit longer. Now you must be thinking, we're nowhere near a bird song. That's because we need to modulate the sine wave's pitch. There are several ways to go about that. Let's instantiate an LFO in the modulator section and set it to a sine wave. Let's set its output range to bipolar instead of unipolar, so it goes from -1 to 1 instead of 0 to 1. Let's make it slightly faster. We can now use that LFO to modulate several parameters on the oscillator. The pitch transposition expressed in semitones, the harmonic parameter, which is also a pitch transposition but expressed as a multiplier, and a linear frequency offset expressed in hertz. All of these options will give you different modulation curves and ranges and will inherently sound different. I recommend playing around with all of them and even modulating several of them at the same time. To delete a modulation, double-click on it. When working on sound effect design and not on musical patches, I tend to lower the harmonic setting to 0 and then manually input a frequency value in hertz. This disables the key tracking, and no matter what key I play, the same frequency is heard. We're still far away from the sound of a bird chirping. Bird songs are high-pitched sounds, so let's play in a higher register. Somewhere above 2K. One of the side effects of disabling the key tracking is that modulating the pitch parameter will not yield any results. We're stuck to modulating the frequency linearly for now. Also, in this part of the spectrum, and given the logarithmic curve of the frequency range, even a 1% modulation is already a lot of hertz. To gain a more precise control of our modulation range, we can create a scale module, route the modulation out of the LFO to its input, plug its output into the frequency parameter modulation, and then lower its static multiplier value to 0.1, essentially dividing the modulation value by 10. We now have a finer range of control. Let's make that LFO rate faster. Alright, we're starting to get into bird territory. But the sound is still a bit too static to sound natural. On top of the trill created by the LFO modulation, let's introduce a slower pitch bend. Let's start by creating a second LFO. Like the first LFO, let's route it to a scale module to divide its output by 10. Let's disable the loop to transform it into what's essentially a one-shot envelope. We can then edit the LFO curve to make all kinds of pitch bends. Toggling the range between unipolar and bipolar can quickly give us very different results. Let's make the volume envelope slightly longer. And let's slow down that LFO. Now we're getting somewhere. But the trill is still sounding too regular, too artificial. We can probably make it sound more natural by modulating it. First, let's tidy up this modulator section a bit. Grouping these modules will help us keep the patch clean and readable. Now, let's create yet another LFO. Let's set it to one-shot mode and set its output range to bipolar. We can now use its output to modulate the rate of that first LFO. Or we could instead attenuate the LFO's output to have the trill on only part of the phrase. Or we could modulate both. Typically, at this stage, I would start printing some of these variations to audio. I'm not going to dive too deep into this setup because it's pretty specific to Cubase, but essentially, every time I instantiate a new synth, sampler, or weird effects chain, I send it to a bus called print bus. And every audio track in my template has its input set to this bus. This allows me to record any patch I create on the fly and to quickly build libraries of custom sources that I'll then edit, layer, or process further. I would then tweak the patch for a few seconds. And as soon as I hear something I like, I print it to audio. You could also start a longer recording and tweak for some time. This will allow you to create a bunch of variations on the quick. but comes with the drawback of having to edit a long file if you get carried away. And I tend to get carried away. Alright, let's try one last bird patch. I'm going to use two LFOs to modulate the amplitude and pitch of the sine wave. I am then going to modulate the rate of these two LFOs with the same macro. The idea is to keep these two LFOs synchronized. This macro can then be modulated by a third LFO.
A few moments later.
Pretty neat, huh? Alright, let's make some insects. Instead of using an LFO, let's create a second oscillator. Being after the output module in the group's signal flow, it's not sent to the master. Instead, it can be used for audio rate modulation. By clicking on the green plus symbol, you can see all the possible modulation targets. By modulating the volume, what you get is called ring modulation. If the modulator's frequency is below 20 Hz, it's basically a tremolo. Above 20 Hz and it starts to generate harmonics. By modulating the pitch, you get exponential FM. By modulating the frequency shift amount, you get linear FM. And by modulating the phase, you get phase modulation, which is known as the classic FM sound. Let's stick to phase modulation for now. Below 20 Hz, the effect is a simple vibrato. Above 20 Hz, the modulation generates additional harmonics. For insect sounds, I tend to find cool results around that 20 Hz zone. For the classic evening cricket sound, a simple LFO on the volume will do the trick. And then it's just a matter of experimentation and trial and error. We need some wind now. Fortunately, it's very easy to make. Let's load a noise module. Let's add a bandpass filter. Let's modulate the volume and the filter's cutoff frequency with 2 random modules. You can get more wind whistle by modifying the slope and Q factor of the filter. And then it's just a matter of layering a few wind pads, adding some delay and reverb to your birds and insects, and you can get a pretty convincing ambience. Alright, until next time, keep exploring.